Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2018 Commercial Buildings Energy Consumption Survey webinar. At EIA here, we call it CBECS. My name is Sarah Grady. I'm a survey methodologist for the CBECS program, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Tuncay Alparslan, Stacy Angel, Joelle Michaels, and Jay Olsen. And they will be sharing findings from the 2018 CBECS, as well as information about how we conducted the survey. Before we get really started, I have a notice to read to you. This WebEx call is being recorded and may be posted on the Department of Energy's website or used internally. All attendees are muted, and you will not be able to share video during the webinar. However, if you do have concerns, please drop off the webinar at this time. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and look at the agenda for this session. We're going to start with an introduction to CBECS, and then move on to highlights from the 2018 CBECS, and then talk about how the survey was conducted, and then some tips and tricks about using CBECS data, and then a question and answer session at the end. Now you'll notice in the bottom right of your screen, there's a chat button. At any time during this webinar, you can put a question into the chat, and I'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar so that your questions can be part of the question and answer session. In addition, many of you submitted questions during the registration process, and we compiled those, and we'll be fielding some of those during that question and answer session as well. It's likely we won't be able to answer absolutely every question, so I'm going to put our email address into the chat momentarily, and it's also in like one of the slides at the end. So please take note of that email address, and if you feel like your question wasn't addressed, please make sure to send us an email, and we will definitely ensure that all questions get answered. And with that, I'd like to invite Tuncay Alparslan to kick us off. He is the lead of the Commercial Buildings and Manufacturing Demand Team here at EIA. Tuncay?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. Very excited to have this opportunity to share our findings from 2018 CBECS with you. As Sarah said, I'm Tuncay Alparslan. I lead the Commercial Buildings Energy Consumption Survey along with the Manufacturing Energy Consumption Surveys. So I'd like to kick off this webinar with some basics. Let's start with the very high-level basics, such as what is CBECS? So CBECS stands for the Commercial Buildings Energy Consumption Survey, and it's the only independent, statistically representative source of national level data, not only on the energy use of commercial buildings, but also on the building characteristics. This data collection produces a snapshot of the commercial building stock and their energy use for a given reference year, and most recently, this was 2018. CBECS is required by Congress, and it's been conducted periodically since 1979. This latest iteration, 2018, was the 11th cycle. Let me clarify the extent of CBECS further by highlighting what it's not. CBECS is not an energy audit. It's not a rating system or a certification program. It's not a walk through the building. So it's not like ASHRAE Level 1 audit. It's not a database of building energy performance data. We simply collect the data and we share the data. We don't have a regulatory role in any of this. So having kind of gone over these really high-level basics, let's dig a little deeper to clarify the scope of CBECS. Let's start with some of our definitions. So what is a commercial building? Let's start with commercial. So we consider a building to be commercial if more than 50% of its floor space is devoted to activities that are neither residential, nor industrial, nor agricultural. And as far as CBECS is concerned, a building is a structure intended for human access, and it needs to be enclosed by walls that extend from the foundation to the roof. CBECS covers all commercial buildings larger than 1,000 square feet, but there are a couple of exceptions. There are a few exceptions, such as, for instance, we don't collect information on standalone parking garages or buildings on military bases. An important concept in CBECS is the building type, and we determine the building type by the principal activity or the function that occupies the most floor space in a building. I'd like to expand on this a little bit because there is some subtlety here. There are some nuances that needs to be clarified, perhaps. It's really important to note that CBECS captures the building as a unit of analysis. In a given building, there might be multiple establishments, multiple businesses. In such a case, CBECS is looking at the building as a whole and determining or classifying the building based on its principal activity. Relatedly, on the other end of the spectrum, we might have situations where a single establishment or business might occupy multiple buildings, right? So in those cases, we still focus on a single building, not the entire establishment, if that's the case. After we make this deck available to you, you're also going to have a chance to use the link at the right, bottom right corner here to learn more about different building types in CBECS. All right. Let's now talk about how CBECS is used. So CBECS provides periodic detailed snapshots of U.S. commercial buildings. And these snapshots are widely used across government, industry, and other organizations to make policy decisions, design energy efficiency programs, forecast energy consumption, inform business investments, and gauge market potential for new products and services. Our customers rely on CBECS information to update energy models and codes and to benchmark energy performance of commercial buildings through multiple standards and certifications programs, including Energy Star. We also incorporate CBECS data in our EIA modeling efforts. Particularly, CBECS allows us to establish a new base year for our annual energy outlook, AEO. So now one might ask what the significance of 2018 data is, given that so much has changed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, having an updated reference year for the commercial sector prior to 2020 is critical in understanding how the sector may have changed. Before the 2018 consumption data, we were released at the end of last year, and we're talking about today, the buildings industry, governments, and researchers were relying on 2012 vintage CBECS data. With the release of 2018 reference year data, our customers can update their models, projections, assessments, to better reflect the state of the market prior to COVID-19 pandemic. Using 2018 data also avoids reflecting temporary impacts of due to COVID-19 over the long term. Also, it's good to keep in mind that all the changes that persist will be captured and reflected in the next CBECS release. For the next CBECS collection, it's worth mentioning that we are also testing the ability to collect new building characteristics information such as occupancy and filtration to better understand the pandemic-related changes. All right, having covered some of the basics, now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Stacy Angel. She's going to provide some highlights from 2018 CBECS results. Stacy, take it away.
Thank you, Tuncay. Now I will turn to what the 2018 CBECS data collection revealed about the U.S. commercial building stock and how those buildings use energy. We learned that commercial buildings are getting larger. In other words, the total floor space grew more than the total number of buildings, and its total consumption. So the total square footage of floor space in the US increased 11% from 2012 to 2018. An average building today is about 16,000 square feet. Between these two survey cycles, 2012 and 2018, the change in energy consumption and the change in the number of buildings was not statistically significant. However, these measures were significantly higher than when EIA began collecting building data in 1979. The number of buildings from 1979 to 2018 increased 59%. So we now estimate 5.9 million US commercial buildings in 2018. During the same period, the energy consumption only grew 17%, estimating 6.8 quadrillion British thermal units or BTUs of energy. So the larger buildings in the building stock are fewer in number. They're only about 2% of the total number of buildings, but they account for about a third of the total commercial floor space and a third of total energy consumption. Those smaller buildings in the building population account for about half the building stock. So there's a lot more of the small buildings, but they only use about 8% of the energy. So CBECS collects energy consumption information for 4 major fuels. Those are electricity, natural gas, fuel oil, and district heat. One of the key metrics coming out of CBECS is energy intensity. And here we're measuring energy intensity as the BTUs of energy consumed over the square foot of building space. A lower energy intensity is often seen as an indicator of a more efficient building. So here you see the total energy intensity has decreased 12% from 2012 to 2018, going from 80,000 BTU per square foot to a little over 70,000 BTU per square foot. The electricity intensity also decreased here by 14%, and natural gas intensity decreased 11%. And those changes in energy intensity were seen as statistically significant in the sample survey. As Tuncay mentioned, CBECS collects information on principal building activities. Here you see that the buildings primarily used for warehouse and storage, offices, and service activities were the most common building types in 2018. Combined, these account for about 40% of both the number of buildings and the total floor space. It's also of note that these warehouse and storage buildings increased more than 25%. The number of warehouse and storage buildings grew more than 25%. There were 3 other building types that had a significant growth in the number of buildings. Those included service, public assembly, and lodging buildings. Now, the energy intensity also will vary by these different building activity types. The least energy efficient buildings are the vacant, the warehouse and storage, and the religious worship buildings. The most energy intensive building type in 2018 was food service, food sales, and inpatient healthcare. Those were the most energy intensive building types in 2018. The energy intensity for the inpatient healthcare buildings decreased the most between our 2012 and 2018 collection. That energy intensity decreased 16%, being the largest energy intensity decrease of all building types. As I mentioned before, a decrease in energy intensity is often seen as something you would observe as a building becomes more efficient. None of the building types had a statistically significant increase in their energy intensity. CBECS also breaks out energy consumption by 10 major end uses. The most common end use continues to be space heating. This accounts for about 1/3 of the total energy consumption in commercial buildings. Space heating was the most prevalent end use for all the fuel types except electricity, where electricity is used mostly for cooling, ventilation, and other end uses before its consumption for space heating. Lastly, I'd like to highlight how the space heating and cooling end uses vary greatly by the climate in the area the building's located. Those buildings in the coldest climates were nearly 5 times more energy intensive for space heating than buildings in the hottest climates. Conversely, cooling energy intensity was higher in the warmer climates. Buildings in the hot and very hot climate zones consume 5 times more energy for cooling than buildings in the cold and very cold climates. Also of note here is how with the 2018 CBECS, we changed the climate region designations to shift groupings of climate zone based on ASHRAE climate zones. We did this in response to comments from our data users, customers across academia and the building industry. They were informing us that their uses more commonly turn to the ASHRAE climate zones for analysis and building codes modeling. So now I'd like to turn things over to Joelle Michaels. She's the CBECS survey manager, and she will be sharing more about survey methodology. Joelle?
Great, thank you, Stacy. So now I'm going to switch gears from the results to how we got there. Here we're going to see a high-level overview of the CBECS process. This is a process that spans about 5 years. Last week, we released some methodology reports on the CBECS website that go along with each of these steps that you see here. We're going to provide you with that link at the end of this webinar. You're going to also learn more about these steps over the next slides, but just in summary, first we construct a sampling frame, and then we select a sample of buildings to be surveyed. Then we conduct the building survey, which is done with building owners and managers. We start processing those data right away, and while we're working on that, we conduct the energy supplier survey. Then we put the building survey and the energy supplier survey data together. We do some more processing, and we combine all that with some weather data. And then finally, we use end use modeling to break out the total energy into its component end uses. The last step shown, publishing the data, we do that at various points in this process as we release reports and data files, both in preliminary and in final forms. So starting off with the first step, before we can field the CBECS, of course, we actually need to have a sample of buildings to interview. It's critical that that sample is representative of the whole country. Every building must have a known chance to be selected and only one chance. Unfortunately, though, there's no existing complete list of buildings that we can use to draw that sample from, so we create one ourselves. We create most of that list by breaking the country up geographically and then taking smaller and smaller areas until we get to segments that are of manageable size. And in those, we list every commercial building in that segment, and that list is called the area frame. However, because there are a lot more small buildings in the country than there are large buildings, if we just use that frame, we wouldn't end up with enough large buildings in the sample. And because large buildings are important and they're really influential to energy use, as you saw back on Stacy's slide, we want to make sure that we cover them well. So what we do is we supplement the area frame with available lists of certain types of large buildings, like hospitals, federal buildings, colleges, airports, and we sample from those at the geographically larger primary sampling unit level rather than just within the segments. So you may have been wondering how we list all the buildings in the selected segments. In the past, we did this with boots on the ground using field listers across the country. They would walk or drive the blocks, writing down information to identify each building, which, as you might imagine, was very costly and it took quite a bit of time. So starting with the 2018 CBECS, we're able to do this remotely using satellite imagery and street level views combined with some other GIS layers. We tested some segments using both methods in 2018, and we found that the virtual listing actually produced a higher quality frame than the field listing. It did a better job finding buildings, it took less time, and of course, it entirely removed the cost of travel. So with satellite and street view coverage constantly improving, we don't expect to ever need to go back to in-person listing again, which is, of course, very good news. So CBECS is actually two surveys in one. The first part is the building survey, and this is where we send interviewers out across the country to interview building owners and managers about the characteristics of their buildings. The 2018 CBECS was notable because for the first time ever, we offered respondents the option to complete the questionnaire on their own using a web version. We did still have to send an interviewer out to the building to locate the best respondent and make sure that they were answering for the same building that was sampled. That's very important. But if the respondent preferred, they could then complete the survey themselves using an online questionnaire. About 44% of the building respondents chose this option. The 2018 CBECS was in the field for about 9 months, starting in April of 2019. We asked a wide variety of questions about building size, use, occupancy, energy sources, uses, equipment, and then annual usage of 4 energy sources. The average questionnaire took about 45 minutes to complete. This phase of the CBECS is voluntary for respondents, and the response rate was around 55%. As we do for each survey cycle, we made questionnaire changes prior to the 2018 CBECS. And we did that based on review of the previous CBECS responses and on discussions that we had with data users like yourselves. For example, we added a new question about the prevalence of EV charging stations. We estimated that 2% of commercial buildings had EV charging stations in 2018, and we found that they were more common at lodging buildings and service buildings. The larger the building, the more likely it was to have EV charging. More than 1/3 of buildings larger than 500,000 square feet reported having EV charging stations. So this is a question that we are planning to keep, and we will probably expand on it for the next CBECS, and we do expect that we will see these numbers increase. Then the second phase of the CBECS is the energy supplier survey. In this part, we contact the energy suppliers of electricity, natural gas, fuel oil, and district heat for the buildings that responded to the building survey. We provide the suppliers with the building addresses and the account numbers for the buildings where the respondents were able to provide them to us. We ask suppliers to provide monthly data to cover all of the reference year. This is done mostly all through a website where suppliers can securely submit their data. And in contrast to the building survey, which, as I mentioned, is voluntary, the ESS is mandatory. Response rates are high. For example, for electricity and natural gas at the supplier level, the response rates were in the mid-90%. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Jay Olsen, who's going to tell you about end-use modeling and how to use our data. Thank you.
Thank you, Joelle. Part of the information that we're releasing as part of the CBECS are the energy end use estimates. This is the amount of energy used for particular end uses. I want to point out that this is not a measured quantity. This is not something that we can collect from building respondents. This information is based on models. Now, the models of expected energy use are based on characteristics of the building collected during the interview, the size, usage patterns, equipment, and things like that. They're also based on weather data from NOAA. They're also based on estimated technology efficiencies from other sources. And finally, the final end-use estimates have to sum up to the total energy consumption that we obtained from the energy supplier survey. So that's another influence on the energy end-use estimates. Now, in much the same way that we've noticed changes in the building stock from previous CBECS to the current CBECS, we've also seen changes in the estimates of energy and use. For example, the change in the characteristics of the lighting equipment used in buildings is reflected in a change in our estimate of the amount of energy used for lighting. This is because much of the lighting in commercial buildings has transitioned away from standard fluorescent tubes and to LEDs, which are more efficient. So in 2018, standard fluorescent lighting was used in 68% of buildings. That's down quite a bit from 84% in 2012. Other bulb types have decreased from 2012 to 2018, not as much as standard fluorescent lighting, but LED use has increased from 9% of buildings in 2012 to 44% of buildings in 2018. And this change in the building stock is reflected in a lower estimate for lighting intensity. That's amount of lighting used per square footage. Now I'd like to cover a few ways that the CBECS data can be used. So up until now, this presentation has covered some highlights of CBECS background, methodology, and some of our findings. In fact, all of the CBECS data has been published. It's available from EIA. On the EIA website, there are 71 data tables with information on number of buildings, floor space, energy use, and cost. There is a public use microdata file with characteristics and energy use information available for all 6,436 surveyed buildings. There are reports, there are summaries and analysis. As part of the Today in Energy article series, there are some CBECS articles, and there are also some more details on the methodology used to produce the 2018 CBECS. This slide lists some of the information that's available on our website. I'm not going to go through everything. You can see that census region and ownership and occupancy and other energy-related characteristics are available. I do want to note the last bullet. The survey was conducted under the CBECS. So the information that we collected is supposed to be confidential, and we do not release any information that could identify individual buildings. So no names, addresses, cities, or even states. But even with that limitation, there's quite a bit of CBECS information available. You can copy the charts and slides on the webpage for your own presentation reports. You can use the 71 tables that have pre-calculated estimates in your own research and analysis. These tables have population estimates with cross-tabulations of the most important energy-related characteristics: location, size, use of building, age of building. You can create your own estimates with the public use microdata file. There's a user's guide that will explain how to do that. You can use Excel, SAS, or R to get estimates from that microdata file. I do want to note that some of the values in the microdata file are imputed, but if for your research you want to separate those out from the reported values, there are variable flags that will help you distinguish which values are imputed and which are reported. A few tips for using the CBECS data. Be careful about estimates based on small sample size. In the pre-calculated tables, we don't provide any estimates that are based on fewer than 20 cases. That might not be a bad practice to follow if you're using the microdata file. If you're using the microdata file to calculate sums and averages, remember that each row in the file is a survey building that represents more than one building. So to get a population total, you'll have to multiply that building's data by a weight that represents how many buildings are represented by that row. To assess how confident we are in the estimates we're providing, we provide relative standard errors. These are provided in the pre-calculated tables, and if you're using the microdata file, you can also calculate RSEs for any estimate that you come up with. I want to point out that CBECS is not a time series. It's a snapshot of the building stock at one particular time. In this case, 2018, the previous one was 2012. And I would like to ask if you cite CBECS, if you use CBECS in any of your papers or presentations, please cite CBECS and let your audience know how you used our data. So for the rest of the presentation, I'd like to turn it back over to Sarah Grady, and she will cover the remaining slides.
Thank you, Jay. So we have a few slides here with URLs for additional information. At the top is the link for the 2018 data tables and the microdata files that Jay was just describing. And then we have a link for the building characteristics report, which provides lots of the graphics that you saw presented throughout this webinar and that was referenced earlier, you could use in your own work. Similarly, the 2018 consumption and expenditures report link contains those same kinds of figures, but about consumption and expenditures. The CBECS methodology link has just recently been updated with a set of new documents that go in depth into our methodology from 2018. And then we have the terminology and building type definitions links and a frequently asked questions page. And for more information, please check out our websites. And these slides will be posted at the website within a few days after the webinar is concluded. And I'd also like to call your attention to the email address there at the bottom of the slide. And I also put that in the chat. So again, please, if you feel like your question wasn't answered, please go ahead and email us. All right, so that wraps up our prepared content for today, and we're going to move along to questions and answers. Our first question is for Tuncay. So Tuncay, we received a lot of questions about Energy Star. Will the 2018 data from CBECS impact Energy Star scores, and if so, when?
Thanks for the question. So to be clear, at EIA, we are not directly involved in Energy Star scores, but we do work closely with EPA, and they use our CBECS data as the basis for most of their 1 to 100 Energy Star scores. I believe EPA has just begun the process to update from the 2012 to 2018 CBECS, and they anticipate that the score updates will be live in the Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool sometime in 2025. And I think EPA will be engaging with stakeholders over the next 2 years to solicit input on these updates.
Great, thank you, Tuncay.
Sure.
We have a question for you, Stacy. How will the 2018 CBECS data impact energy target goals for commercial buildings, like those in the 2030 challenge, or programs and policies to accelerate the adoption of energy efficiency technologies and practices?
Thank you. As an independent statistical agency within the U.S. Department of Energy, we collect and publish the statistics that others will use. So many of the policies and programs you mentioned might use our data and help with program design or in determining and calculating their own targets. But that data is our data is being used by them as well as others. Tuncay mentioned a number of data uses for the CBECS data. So we are a policy neutral agency, and we're collecting this data for a variety of statistical purposes. So how that will be, other target goals will be impacted. Folks should connect with the entities involved in those designs to see how they'll be using our data. And they also are welcome to come ask us questions about our data as they see this new release and look at integrating the 2018 statistics.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stacy. Joelle, we have a question for you. It's about building type activities. Will you be building type and building activities? Will you be making data available for more detailed building activities? For example, will you be separating out elementary, middle, and high schools or public schools, or even specific types of public safety buildings?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do, we already have published information about around 50 subcategories of building activities. So right now there's 5 CBECS data tables that break these out. There's 2 of them in the building characteristics section underneath building activity. And then there are 3 tables in the consumption section. There's one under major fuels, there's one under electricity, and there's one under natural gas. Those are, I think, C12, C22, and C32. And those have energy consumption information for the 50 subcategories. In addition to that, we make the subcategory variable, which is called PBA+. We make that available in our public use microdata, so anybody can use it and create their own estimates that aren't in the published tables. So like, right, if you were interested in public schools, you could use the, if, say you were interested in public high schools, you could use the variable for high schools and combine that with the government-owned, variable for like local government-owned buildings to look at public schools. One other thing is that we are going to be releasing a series of building activity reports in the next few months that are going to go a little more into depth into the building activities. So if you're interested in a specific activity, you can get more information about that.
Thank you, Joelle. All right, our next question is for Stacy. What's the process for soliciting new questions for future surveys?
Great. During the presentation, we discussed that designing the questionnaire involves a number of steps. We review how buildings responded to the survey in the last cycle and look to make improvements to the form design and questionnaire. We maintain a current market knowledge of building technologies and practices. We do want to hear from our data users and we solicit their input. And we pre-test all the survey forms and do cognitive testing to ensure we can get quality responses. All these survey changes will need to go through review and public comment and a Federal Register notice process managed through the Office of Management and Budget. We also love to hear from our data users and respondents. So if you are interested in hearing about future opportunities to provide comment, we really encourage you to join our listserv or email us directly. I know, Sarah, you've put the email address in the chat already. I'll go in and just put it in again in case folks want to opt into getting notified of future opportunities to provide comments to the future surveys. That sound good?
Yes, thank you, Stacy.
Okay.
And I think that's a good segue to a question that's coming up a lot in our chat. And I'm going to smush a few questions together for Tuncay. When is the next CBECS? How often is CBECS updated? And are we going to get state level data next time?
Those are very good questions, and we do get those questions quite frequently. I'll start by the first one. We're currently in the project planning phase for our next cycle, for which the reference year would be 2025. CBECS comes out, it hasn't been exactly periodic, but it takes about 5 to 6 years to release the next set of data. Could you repeat the last part of the question, Sarah?
Yes, are we going to get state level data?
Oh, how I wish. Unfortunately, CBECS is not going to be able to provide state level data because for us to be able to provide statistically representative data, we would need so many more respondents in our survey, and that kind of runs into cost constraints. Unfortunately, we are not able to provide state level data at the next CBECS, but one would hope down the line.
Thank you, Tuncay. All right, Tuncay, you again.
Okay.
Can CBECS be used to address industrial use buildings?
That's a good question. The answer is no, not CBECS, but our team has a separate survey that covers the manufacturing establishments, It's called the Manufacturing Energy Consumption Survey, or the MECS. And there's a link to that right on the CBECS site, CBECS page. If you go to that, you're going to be able to get to the MECS site pretty easily.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
This next question is for Jay. What is the accuracy of the data that you collect? And some folks in the chat were wondering about, outliers in the data, extremely low or high electricity consumption. What can you say about the accuracy of the data?
Well, there are a couple things we do to make sure that the data we're publishing are reflective of the commercial building population. So before data collection, when we construct the sample that we're going to, we make sure to oversample large buildings and buildings that maybe use energy more intensely than other buildings. It's because those buildings are very influential on the final, the final estimates of energy use. So we want to make sure we have enough of them so that we have a good sample and a smaller relative standard error. Before going out in the field, we do a lot of work on the CBECS questionnaire. We do some cognitive testing to ensure that the questions are asked clearly and in a manner that we can get a high quality response. The questionnaire also integrates skip patterns and cross-check responses to make sure the answers we're getting are consistent. After we receive the data, we do a careful review of the building characteristics, like square footage, number of workers, and there's more details on that in our new methodology documentation. But while we're doing these checks, we do look at outliers and things that may be inconsistent to make sure that there is a plausible reason why a building might have a high consumption per square foot. There's a lot of activity in there, perhaps, or it's a small building with a disproportionate amount of activity. We also double check the energy consumption. We collect energy consumption data from both building respondents and suppliers, because we know that sometimes one of those is better suited to provide the data than the other. And we run a series of edits on that energy data we collect. And in cases where we received it from both building and suppliers, we had rules to determine which one was the best or most accurate for the building in question.
Thank you, Jay. Our next question is for Joelle, and this has been appearing in the chat a bit. Does CBECS include multifamily buildings or have plans to do so in the future?
No. So no, it doesn't currently. CBECS does not currently include multifamily. Multifamily have been a known data gap in our office's end-use consumption surveys. But so the residential energy consumption survey recently did a pilot study to move towards adding that as part of the data collection. And they have released a report out on their website. If you go to the RECS Residential Energy Consumption Survey website, you can find that report. So it is something that we are actively looking to start doing in the future.
Great, thank you, Joelle. And if you'll stay in video here, the next question is for you as well. Could you talk about the timeline for CBECS and, why does it take, some might say, why does it take so long to get your data?
Right. So one thing to remember, so the 2018 CBECS, we don't actually even start going to collect the data until 2019. As I said, we went into the field in April of 2019. And we do that because we're collecting energy consumption data from respondents, and you can't collect the energy data if they haven't used it yet. So we wait until then to start collecting it. And so that data collection ran till about the end of 2020. Then we got the first we had to wait to find out which buildings responded to that before we could start doing the energy supplier survey. So that started in April of 2020. And we were working on like our QC of the building's data during that whole time. And we were able to, so we released our preliminary characteristics estimates at the end of 2020. So it was less than a year after the end of data collection. Then there takes time after supplier collection to put everything together and to do the end use modeling and such. So we ended up releasing our energy consumption data about 2 years after the end of that. It was a little bit longer than usual for various reasons, but we are also looking at ways that we can help reduce that gap. But bottom line is that because we're not even going out into the field until 2019 for the 2018 CBECS, it's always going to seem like we have a long lag in our publishing.
Thank you, Joelle.
That answered it. Okay.
Okay, this next question is for Jay. There's a lot of interest in the energy intensity, and folks are wondering about the key drivers for energy usage intensity and for seeing that sort of lower energy intensity between 2012 and 2018.
Well, it depends on, of course, the building type and the things that are going on in the building. I would say that for lighting especially, I think we have seen some genuine efficiency increases in the population, and that is reflected in the intensity we're collecting there. The same thing is possibly true of cooling. Did they have a specific decrease intensity that they were asking about, or?
So there was interest in the slide that showed the healthcare industry showing the decrease in energy intensity.
Well, it's difficult to answer on the fly. Part of that could be, lighting efficiency. Part of it could just be HVAC efficiency, better heating and cooling equipment, perhaps. And maybe just usage. If there are fewer people using the healthcare building, that would possibly be reflected in the efficiency.
Great. And someone was wondering if sort of new construction or newer buildings plays a role here.
I think it's a little hard to disentangle the effect of where the new buildings are from, whether they're more efficient. I think in general, they tend to be in areas that are that use heating less and that use electricity more. That is to say, they're all electric buildings are buildings that depend on electricity, rather than fossil fuels for heating. So, in general, apples to apples, I think they are more efficient, but it's not immediately obvious just looking at the electricity intensity of new construction.
Great. Thank you, Jay. The next question is for Stacy. Folks are wondering about electrification and energy intensity. What can we say about what to expect in the future?
Okay, well, we are a statistical collection of 2018 data, so I will not be speaking to the future. I'll leave that to my colleagues in the annual energy outlook. But what I could do looking backwards is just look at total consumption of energy since we first started collecting data from commercial buildings. So back in 1979, electricity's share of the total energy consumption was under 50%, like high 30s, where today in the 2018 collection, it's 60% of total consumption is electricity, where over that same period of time, the natural gas consumption still accounts for about 1/3 of all energy consumption. So we are seeing more electricity consumed versus other fuels. The largest share of electricity consumption is in the South, and the Midwest has the largest share of natural gas consumption. So there are a lot of differences in the different regions. Some of that could be the climate zone, you know, the end use requirements across the different places based on weather. There's other characteristics of buildings that affect how much they use of different energy sources. The mix of building types, like Jay was saying, can affect what you're seeing in energy consumption. So I really encourage folks to take a look at our BC tables, the building characteristics tables. We have a lot of characteristics information, the energy sources used, the type of equipment in the buildings, the type of heating equipment, energy practices, type of cooking equipment, water heating. So that information with that baseline to 2018 can really help understand what the market looks like today in terms of electrifying certain end uses or how much are being using electric. We did take a cut on the numbers in response to a customer inquiry and found that it was slightly over a quarter of all buildings that only use electricity. 28% of buildings only use electricity, where the rest of those buildings would use electricity and another fuel, or there's a real small percent that don't even use electricity. Across all the buildings that use electricity for primary heating, that's a big end use. We talked about space heating using a lot of energy, a third of the total consumption. Most of those buildings that are using electricity for space heating are in the south, and it's about 30% of buildings that will use electricity as a primary heating fuel. I think there's some interest about heat pumps. You may have mentioned that. We're seeing that in 11% of commercial buildings, the heat pump technology. And we weren't seeing a statistically significant change in the number of heat pumps installed in commercial buildings between 2012 and 2018. So that may be of interest to some folks who are interested in the electrification space. Was there another part of the question or anything else?
No, I think that covered it. Thank you.
Great.
Okay. Joelle, does CBECS publish information about data centers?
Yes, we do. However, we do not publish, well, I guess it's sort of. We don't get enough data for standalone data center buildings. They're very rare in the population. So without a list, a complete list of data centers, we can't sort of incorporate those into our sample to make sure we get enough of them. So we don't have enough of those in our sample because we have not been able to find such a list. So we do have some in the sample, but they get combined into the other building activity category in our published data products. But we do have information about data center spaces within buildings. That's a question that we ask in the questionnaire. Is there any space used for a data center? And we ask the total floor space of that data center. We ask about how many servers are used. So we have that information in our tables and in our public use microdata file. We also did a data center pilot report as part of the main CBECS data collection in 2018, and there's a report about that out on the methodology page of our website as well. We did 50 data centers as a pilot, and it found that we would need, as I mentioned, we'd need like a high quality frame in order to put them into our sample, but also we'd need some help from the industry to get cooperation, get those to help to respond because data centers tend to be private about their data. So it remains a challenge for us, but it's something we're interested in continuing to try to get data on.
Great, thank you, Joelle. Jay, this question is for you. This is, again, some smushing of different questions that have come in, but there seems to be general interest in understanding what kinds of estimates people can get at what level. So there were questions of like, can I get estimates at the region level, at the climate zone level? Can I look at intensity by my building type in my region, in my climate zone, those kinds of things?
Yes, some of those region variables and location variables are in our pre-published tables. More of them are in the public use microdata file. So if you're interested in hospitals in a particular census division, you could, pull that data out of the microdata file. That's just a typical example. But we do caution if you do a bunch of cross-references, hospitals constructed after 1980 in the Pacific Census Division, you might be dealing with too few cases to get a statistically reliable estimate. But just to take, kind of a high-level thing, the smallest geographic division is Census Division. There's no state-level data. Above Census Division, of course, is Census Region. And kind of orthogonal to that is the climate zone. I believe there are 5 climate zones in the country and in the microdata file. I believe that's it as far as the lowest level of detail goes.
Great. Thank you, Jay. I think we have time for maybe one more question. And Joelle, I think I'll ask you to field this. So there were various questions in the chat about like who is actually going out to buildings and collecting this information. And is it sort of like an assessor doing an assessment, or is it EIA staff who are going out to interview, like that, those kinds of questions? Could you talk more about what that interview process is like?
Sure. We hire professional interviewers. We hire a survey contractor, a survey research company who hires interviewers who go out to the buildings. So they are not energy professionals. They are really good at gaining cooperation and getting into a building. We train them on the questionnaire, and they're good at what they do. For the 2012 CBECS, we did a study where we did a subsample and we sent energy assessors to go in and do the same, collect it using like an instrument like they would use for an audit, going through the building, walking around and doing it themselves. And we actually found that the quality of the data were no better by people who, really knew their energy. So, and they weren't good at getting the building to respond and scheduling. So that's such a skill, and it's such an important skill to make sure we get the response rate that we get. And especially now too with the web version of the questionnaire, it really is more about getting to the building, making sure it's the right building that is, the person realizes exactly what the structure is they're supposed to be answering for, gain their cooperation, get them into the instrument, and get them to answer the questions themselves. So did that answer the question, Sarah?
Yes, that answered the question. Thank you. All right, so that wraps up our time. Again, please feel free to email us if you have a burning question that you feel didn't get answered. This slide deck and a recording will be available on the EIA website within probably a few days after today. And again, you can always email us if you didn't see it and would like it or that kind of thing. But thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to more CBECS in the future.